Welcome everyone to this video. This is an emergency news report. As I promised in the second episode of the Victor News Network, I said that the hottest topic that was happening at that moment was the Tucker Carlson and the Master Strategist interview. And I promised that I'll make a video going as much as I can, looking over the things that were discussed. And in the end, I'll be taking out a few key takeaways and draw up an overall conclusion about this entire thing. It's also my personal opinion. Or, as you can know, I don't represent anybody. There are some things in that were discussed in the interview, which I cannot guarantee. I have the full information, so do not expect full sincerity, because even I'm blindsided by a few things. But what I will say is that I will try to do my best when it comes to this. Starting as much as we can chronologically, because these notes, I've written them just as I listened to the interview when it got released on Tucker's website. We start first with Poland cooperating with Hitler. That's for starters, a factual bullshit. Poland did cooperate with Germany post 1918, so when Germany already lost the war and the Treaty of Versailles happened, and we know how terrible that went. But Poland, after the war, has managed to found a second republic, meaning that in the western regions of even current-day Poland, uh, said places were full of Germans. And also, on top of that, in the east you had Prussians, which were also Germans themselves. And the collaboration between Poland and Germany, not with Hitler particularly, but with Germany, happened specifically, in order to either look into solutions to move the German minorities from Poland into Germany, or solutions in order to integrate said Germans into Poland. The Polish already found out somewhere around 1933, especially when Josef Piłsudski died, uh, and Hitler already came into power, what sort of people the Germans were, and how much absolute hatred Hitler had towards them. Uh, there was also this bullshit thing that Putin mentioned, that apparently the Polish participated in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia with Hitler. If you don't know what exactly happened, just search and read the Munich betrayal, which was actually the Munich Agreement, when German forces effectively forcefully invaded the Czechoslovakia in order to occupy the Sudetenland, which was majority German and also a product of the post-World War I breakup of Germany. And even though, yes, the Polish did get a very small area in Czechoslovakia, the vast majority of it was something that the Germans, and especially Hitler's Germany, that took over. Moving on, apparently the USSR, according to Putin, tried to help Czechoslovakia against partitioning. They wanted to send troops there, but the Polish refused the transit of troops on their territory in order to somehow protect the Czechoslovaks against the Russians and help them in their struggle for independence. That is also completely bullshit. And here's something pretty simple. The Germans back then were already working with the USSR for a few years, and the main motivation for that was that Germany wanted to rearm, especially since Hitler took power, and they didn't find any better place to do it, which also had a manufacturing base other than the USSR. And but yeah, why do you think pacts such as Molotov-Ribbentrop exist? Uh, well, other pacts have existed before that. How do you think Germany managed to build such a significant uh, war force before they launched the war in 1939, when, according to the Treaty of Versailles, they were restricted to only 100,000 troops. They were no longer capable of having an armored tank corps, and they were no longer able to have an air force. The troops were trained within the USSR. The Panzer Corps was trained in the USSR, and the Luftwaffe was also trained in the USSR, and quite a few planes were also built in the USSR. Planes that the Luftwaffe used against the Allies and subsequently against the USSR themselves not long after, because and I don't exactly have to say this, but when the Austrian painter looked at the situation and seeing the things as they were all around them, he just simply wanted to find the best solution, and also made quite a dangerous bet, which to some extent it partially worked in the favor of Germany. And in return for all this assistance that they receive from the USSR, they would actually transfer quite a significant amount of technology in the USSR, especially technology related to airplanes. But the bet was that the German manufacturing processes and the availability of some raw resources, they were simply the Russians were simply not capable of keeping up with the German know-how. Then Putin goes towards talking about how somehow Lenin built Ukraine in 1922, and then 20 minutes pass in the interview. Then Putin says, "Well, Stalin actually created the Ukraine." On the topic with Lenin creating the Ukraine, that it's important to at least have a background related to what exactly happened. It was quite a shit show after the February Revolution, but specifically after the October Revolution. I'll try to present a condensed form as much as I can, although be sure that it is incomplete. If we were to discuss about this, it would have taken hours. So this is as much as I can mention about this topic, and how much bullshit is actually uh, in the interview. So the Ukrainian Popular Republic was founded after the October Revolution in 1917, and the first thing they did was to declare independence from Russia. So that would be the formerly Tsarist Russia. It covered all of the current-day Ukraine plus a piece of southern Belarus, the western part bordering Belarus of Bryansk. There was also the Belhorod or the Belgorod Oblast, depending on which language you prefer. The only exceptions to the Ukrainian Popular Republic, aside from Crimea, were most of Luhansk Oblast and the eastern half of the Donetsk Oblast. Do you see a pattern here by any chance? If you look at the current borders or at the current conflict, those were still back then, and they are still now strongly pro-Russian. Not only because there were quite a lot of Russians that moved there, uh, because they were still heavily industrialized areas, with a lot of factories built surprisingly by the Americans, especially after Lenin died and after Stalin took power. and so since it was a heavily industrialized area, all the worker unions were deeply infiltrated with communists. So shortly after the Russian Civil War began in 1917, that also included the Ukrainian War of Independence. And on the Ukrainian side, you had quite a mix of parties fighting between each other. You had the Ukrainian Popular Republic in itself. You had the Poles, who also had their own interests in Galicia and parts of Western Ukraine. That's the reason why, if you go to Western Ukraine right now, the Ukrainian that's spoken there all contains quite a lot of Polish terms. You also had the Greens, which were essentially armed peasant militias all over Ukraine, but situated mostly in northeastern and central Ukraine itself. Then you've also had the Whites, so those were the main troops that fought against the Red Guards founded by the Bolsheviks. And you've also had the anarchists themselves, plus the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. That's where the first instance the Central Rada came into existence again after centuries. But the problem of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic was that while it did try its best to emulate the governance principles of old, in uh, again instituting the Central Rada, which is the Ukrainian version of the parliament. They didn't exactly have a standing army or some sort of military backup in order to also enforce their own principles. And So, as I mentioned, everybody fighting against each other, and it was quite a chaotic situation across all over Ukraine. Not long after, in 1918, the Germans backed a coup and installed a chap called Pavlo Skoropadsky, who was I think a lieutenant or lieutenant general, as head of the second hetmanate. The Helbani being a term that comes from the Zaporizhian Cossacks, and the second Hetmanate essentially lasted for a few months until the Social Democrats uh, part of the Ukrainian Popular Republic led an uprising and ousted him. And Skoropadsky left Ukraine once he was forced to abdicate in order to live the rest of his life essentially there. But Lenin, seeing the complete chaos that was happening, and more importantly, uh, Russia, or the Soviet Federative Socialist Republic of Russia, as it was known back then, was still heavily reliant on grain imports from Ukraine. And when a country which you depend on so much on with such basic goods starts fighting between each other, uh, Lenin was already pretty quick in acting towards the interests of the what will become the USSR. He appointed a chap called Vladimir Antonov to squash the rebelling Ukrainians, and also the French expeditionary forces that were sent to Odessa, and they were also stationed in Mykolaiv. Then in 1920, the Poles and the Ukrainians signed the Treaty of Warsaw, as Poland in itself was at war against the USSR. And by the way, the Poles won that war, which is quite a premiere, considering that there were much bigger countries on this planet that waged war against Russia. And even though we like to make fun of the winter war between Finland and the Soviet Union, well, the Finnish still lost in the end. The Germans lost, as we know, in World War II. Napoleon lost again. So it appears that in the modern history, the only much smaller countries but countries which know very well what sort of country and what sort of people the Russians are, managed to win. Here I'm talking about either the Poles, although the Poles did have the advantage of having a bigger population, which is what the Finnish didn't have, and Japan as well. The Russo-Japanese War when Russia was still a tsardom. So then the Peace of Riga was signed, and that sought from the Polish side to gather some territories that were lost during the partition centuries ago. Here I'm talking specifically about the 18th century, if I'm right. Well, I probably mean 1772. So that was when the first Polish Republic disappeared in the partition, and their interest was to gain back territories that were still heavily Polish. Also, since the war was carried out against the USSR and the Russians being the Russian problem, they've been back then. The, they've been back then centuries ago. They were the problem a century ago. They're still a problem now, as we see. Uh, they also wanted to receive quite hefty reparations from the USSR itself. Moving on, in order to assert the legitimacy of Moscovia, Putin mentioned the Bogdan Khmelnytsky letter sent to Moscow in 1650 from the Ukrainian Rus. And he also says that it is translated in Russian. What he didn't tell you is that said letter was originally written in Ukrainian. And this is such a fact that you cannot contest. Even Soviet doc manuals that were doctored in order to ignore such aspects willingly, in order to not give minorities legitimacy, even those mentioned that the letter was in Ukrainian. And yeah, as you can see, the aspect that you can get from this is that Ukrainian back then was quite a different language from Russian. He then goes on to say that Lenin did promote national languages during the USSR, and that was partially right. The program that he's talking about was called Korenizatsiya, and that was a policy that was drawn up by the Bolsheviks in 1913, and it was implemented in the 1920s. However, the 1920s historically were a crazy time in the USSR, and the vast majority of it can you can put the blame on the idealism of the Bolsheviks, and said Bolshevik idealism nearly broke the society from the seams. Take for example divorce rates. It didn't take too long for the divorce rate to get to 80%, which was something unheard of in the rest of the planet back then, because in the Bolshevik idea, marriage was a construct that was implemented by the church. And so when the Bolsheviks took power, and they just turned divorce into a simple administrative act that you can go just as easily as renewing your ID card or your passport. You can just simply divorce as a man from a woman just like that, or a woman divorce a man. That happened to be the vast majority of cases. Of course, chaos would have ensued. You had a lot of broken families. You had hundreds of thousands of children that ended up being part of single parent homes back then. And just as I mentioned earlier, part of Bolshevik idealism and part of the main tenets of Bolshevism was to also destroy the religion. That meant the Russian Orthodox Church, the same Russian Orthodox Church that now Putin praises and says that he likes to be part of. But in reality, the Russian Orthodox Church is just a lackey of Kremlin, just like absolutely everything else in that country. And also, in order to destroy the traditional values, the bourgeoisie, who still maintained some traditionalism and some of the old education, that very few that existed and was accessible to the population back during Tsarist Russia, they were either kicked out, they either ran away, or they were outright shot or imprisoned by the authorities. And I'm pretty sure that, but in the very slim chance that you don't know why did the Bolsheviks do this, it's simply because the state doesn't need competition. If you want to control a country, you must center everything around the state. You must make people dependent on the state. Because if you don't make the people dependent on the state, and if you don't make the people subservient to the state, then on a long enough time span, you're going to have a rebellion of some sort, whether it is ideological, and that's the reason why they got rid of religion, or you're going to have an ideological one, which is why they got rid of the bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia that used to exist before the October Revolution. Moving on, Putin mentioned an example when he went to Bergovo, which is a city in Transcarpathia that happens to be mostly Hungarian. He says that in Beregovo, the street names were written in Russian and Hungarian, but not Ukrainian, when he visited the place in the 1980s. And he also praised the fact that Hungarian people in Transcarpathia were also wearing their traditional clothes. He initially thought that they were some sort of people wanting to attend the carnival. But let me tell you this. The fact that not just the Hungarians, but also the Romanians in Chernivtsi Oblast maintained the traditions and the writing was happened in spite of the USSR, not thanks to the USSR. And and the reason why they escaped a lot of the anguish other minorities, which were larger and more concentrated in other parts of the former USSR, was simply because the Transcarpathia in itself is a very mountainous area. It's looking at the name of it's an area that's part of the Carpathian mountain chain. And the reason, for example, why if you look at development maps in Romania, you see quite stark differences between the regions and the natural borders that are present right there are exactly the Carpathian Mountains, because it's really difficult to go for those mountains whenever you want to build anything like railways or motorways or anything. That is also why historically there were such differences between people in Transylvania, but think and act in a different way. They were also because of proximity to Austria-Hungary. That's why Moldovans themselves are quite a different people compared to Muntenia and Oltenia from southern Romania, because the natural border has always been the Carpathian Mountains, and they were difficult. They're difficult to go across, which is why uh, Austria-Hungary had quite a big influence in Transylvania, simply because, yeah, Moldova, Muntenia, and Oltenia, so that means former Wallachia, they were for centuries under the boot of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire had found it nearly impossible to cross the Carpathians in order to go further and for example, invade Transylvania. And it's worth also mentioning here, since later in this video and this entire interview, the situations with minorities that exist in countries, especially in this case, the Russian minority in the Donbas region. Uh, when the maps were drawn for the Soviet Socialist republics that would form the USSR, uh, Stalin started with a really great idea in order to prevent any future any future treason, just as what the Ukrainians tried to do when they fought against the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. What he decided to do, and Ukraine is not sadly a unique case. There are a lot of other countries that I'll mention in a bit. Is that when the borders were drawn up, the borders were also drawn up to also include certain enclaves of highly concentrated minorities, specifically in the case in a case when a rebellion would appear in the future. That said population will be there to act as a counterweight and to especially act as some sort of a tank trap in order to also provide the blockage required that the national troops wouldn't go through it that easily, but also leave enough time for the troops of the rest of the USSR to get in there. So, as I already provided the Ukrainian example with the Russians in the Donbas area, take for example, in the most recent conflict that ended as of the 9th of February 2024, the Republic of Artsakh, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Both countries were part of the Soviet Union, and but in that case, it was Nikita Khrushchev that drew the borders and specifically wanted to leave that Armenian enclave within Azerbaijan, especially because the Azeris were very upset when they were integrated in the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union essentially just came in and took absolutely all oil drilling technology that they had. Kind reminder, Azeris were the very first country on the planet to invent offshore oil platforms, and that was during the 1910s. In the 1910s, the Americans weren't even dreaming of starting to drill in the Gulf of Mexico for oil. The same case can also be made when it comes to countries in Central Asia as well. Say the best example that I can provide there is the region of Karakkal, Pakistan, and all the problems that the region created over the years. But Central Asia, particularly, is an egregious example because because the vast majority of it, yeah, they really were Turkic tribes, which did not exactly see much civilization up until the USSR came through and forcefully civilized them. From some points of view, you can make an argument that it was advantageous for them, but from other points of view, they caused a myriad of disasters on a scale which is unheard of absolutely anywhere else in the world. Best example that I can provide is the Aral Sea, and how difficult, even to this day, is to bring that sea back and to reverse the no, not only the natural but also the economic catastrophe and the social catastrophe that led to it in the end, because simply the USSR wanted to farm for cotton there. Moving on to this, uh, Putin also mentioned that China's potential is much bigger than the USA's, quoting Bismarck on how it is important to look at the potential of a country. In this part, also put in light about the fact that the Chinese population is 1.5 billion people, I assume he did not get the update from the Chinese themselves, mind you. So I'm not exactly quoting some other anti-Chinese conspiracists or outright enemies of China. The Chinese themselves said even if more than a year ago, and also reiterated this point currently as well, that in reality there are 1.14 billion people inside China. He then continues to say that the Chinese purchasing power parity is the biggest in the world, even bigger than the USA's. And I'm not exactly sure how the hell does Putin measure the purchasing power parity, but it isn't like that. You don't simply take the GDP, adjust it to the PPP, and then you divide the population, or you find the PPP per capita, and then you multiply by the population, and that's how you get. Oh yeah, the China number one because of this number. Uh, what exactly what the Chinese do? Yeah, they may probably have as an aggregate, but even if in reality it doesn't basically it doesn't matter anything. On top of that, let's also not forget this aspect that the Chinese also lie in the statistics, and the reason why the Chinese lie in the statistics more so than the Russians, even the Russians lie in the statistics, but the differences vary. The reason why the Chinese lie in the statistics and then lie in general about their country is that they're an external shame-based society compared to say for example any country in the Western world that is an internally looking guilt-based society, while in the West we have the tendency to badmouth our countries simply because we had something called Christianity, and Christianity fostered this guilt about ourselves to look inwards and to see that we're not excellent, we are flawed by nature, we are flawed by design, and we cannot be as good. And so that sense of guilt in itself is the thing that propelled the Western society to where it used to be in history and to where it still is now. While in China, the things are quite the opposite. When it comes to interactions with the outside world, the the societal dogma dictates that everything must look great, everything must look amazing, and within the country, they are willfully ignorant about all the issues that the country is facing, simply because they wouldn't want to admit the Chinese were never a country to admit that they had issues uh, with their own country. That's the reason why if you look at the way China is portrayed both by their media but also by the naive media in the West, you always see the high-tech buildings from Beijing, or you see the high-tech free trade zone of Shenzhen, or you see the humongous port of Tianjin, or the cosmopolitan metropolis of Shanghai. You don't exactly hear about uh, how depressing or how dirty and outright dangerous places like the industrial city of Shanxi is, or even worse. So you're never going to hear about how bad living in Uiguristan is, or any other places, because that would generate shame, and the shame is essentially the kryptonite of China. If you really want to get the Chinese people, a Chinese person mad, especially a Chinese person that cares for some reason about the PRC, you simply start bad-mouthing the country. That's why their reactions are so visceral. The reason why Russians and the US and doesn't matter if it was Tsarist Russia or if it was the USSR, but the USSR in particular. and then the Russian Federation as well. The They simply lie because with the Bolsheviks they also adopted this aspect that could be called part of their culture. They won, but when it comes to USSR, the reason why they did it is that they had the USA as their main competitor, and the main communist ideologues weren't stupid into seeing how the Americans and the Western world were a formidable enemy on from all parts. That's the reason why uh, a lot of countries, why not all countries, but why, for example, the space race was uh, was so tight between the USSR and the USA, even though, yes, it was amazing as it happened, but if we are to look in retrospective right now, if we are to commit that sin of looking from a retrospective, uh, that sure did provide an outlook into the technological prowess of each country, but in reality, that did not exactly help quite a lot one thing or another. Sure, the Russians may have sent the first satellite in space, but then the Americans went first on the moon. Sure, the Americans ended up on the moon, and then what happened after that? Not much happened after. It took decades up until the subject of the moon was brought back into discussion. And the reason, yeah, going back to what I said earlier, the reason why the Russians lied in the statistics is that if the Russians would have lost face against the USA, NATO, and the Western world, it wouldn't have affected the USSR itself as much as it would have affected their other allies in the rest of the world. It would have simply been the worst bad PR stunt on the planet if they were to be somehow perceived to be humiliated. They don't even have to be properly humiliated. They just have to be seen as humiliated. That's why also uh, the Russian secret services are famous for for the secrecy, which we can't exactly call it secrecy, more like a secretomania. It's secrecy taken up to a pathological level, which is a thing that is still easily to be observed right now. And it's also a thing that if you don't want to observe it in Russia, you see in other countries that that were under the boot of a communist system in this world. So, continuing on, Putin mentioned that in a discussion between Bill Clinton and Vladimir Putin, I assume that was back in 2000, Russia got tricked by the West because the NATO expanded westwards. And tied to that, Bill Clinton and Putin discussed when they met, discussed verbally, because there's no paper trail of this, discussed about joining NATO. And what Bill Clinton said, according to Putin, he mentioned that in that it's not possible right now. So yeah, starting first with the discussion between Bill Clinton and Putin. The reason why Putin put that answer, he wasn't exactly dumb back then. Uh, uh, Kind reminder, Putin is a former KGB agent, a former KGB agent that was also stationed in East Germany, so in the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, not the capitalist West Germany. The reason why Putin put that question is that he knew that he was going to get a negative answer. He wanted to put Bill Clinton on the spot. Putin isn't stupid to not realize that NATO back then during the Cold War was essentially the Fuck Russia alliance, but NATO also remained the Fuck Russia alliance even after the USSR collapsed. It's just that NATO in itself as an alliance was still unclear about how fuck Russia they are uh, during the so-called transition period. So that will be between 1991 when the USSR fell again under Gorbachev and up until the moment when Putin took power in 1999, I think. Also on this topic with NATO and the expansion. Putin says that, to reiterate, that Russia got tricked by the West, specifically by the Americans, I think he means here, because NATO expanded westwards. It's as if in the mind of Putin, you don't, it doesn't exactly register in his system something called the right of self-determination of nations. It's not that the Americans somehow manipulated all the Eastern European countries, all of them, which happen to be under the boot of the communists of a communist regime, whether directly or indirectly. Meaning here the Baltic states, so Estonia, Latvia, and Estonia being directly under the boot of the USSR led from Moscow, or whether you had a communist government separate from the USSR but still heavily influenced by the USSR, such as Poland, or whether you had a communist system that was still communist but it kind of did its own thing. Take for example here Romania, or but Romania being the best example out of these. All these countries, when they were given the option and when they saw, they they jumped to it, not because they were manipulated by the Americans into doing it, because honestly, even Trump mentioned it. Why do you think Trump, back when he was still president, still kept on pressuring all sorts of nations in order to fund in order for them themselves to fund the defense budget and not rely as much on the USA? It would have been a financial net loss for the Americans back then, just as much as would have been right now to absorb more countries. Uh, but simply, the not always, but simply, each Eastern European country wanted to join NATO because they wanted to, not because they were forced into it, which is what I think that Putin has in his mind. He simply cannot get rid of that working aspect of the former Soviet regime. It was their choice to do it, and we will get back to the topic of NATO slightly later on. He then mentions how Russia was humiliated back when Boris Yeltsin was still a president, because when Yeltsin lost the elections and then I think Putin came to power. Yeltsin, well, when he was still president, he was accused of alcoholism, and he was accused of a lot of things, and that's how Russia got discredited and humiliated and wasn't taken seriously as a country. Well, it is true that Yeltsin was accused of alcoholism. It not Lenin. Yeltsin was an alcoholic, and this is something that you can document yourself. You just look at the things that happened when he was hosted at the White House by I think it was also Bill Clinton, although I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure it was Bill Clinton as well. Um, Part of the story from when Yeltsin was hosted at the White House is that at some point the U.S. Secret Service was panicking within the White House because Yeltsin woke up somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, blind drunk, naked, and the reason why he was blind drunk is because he somehow found an alcohol cabinet, God knows where, in what room of the White House, drank as much as he could from that because it was all high quality alcohol, and then he ran naked, and he started interacting with every Secret Service member that tried to actually get him back into his room and then put him back on the bed. He just ran around naked wanting pizza. That was Boris Yeltsin. I'm not making it up. You can read on all of this yourselves. It's public information. Then Putin moves on in this interview to talk about uh, Russia joining the EU, which was a thing that happened in 2022. So this was coupled with the aforementioned discussion about Russia joining NATO as well. Well, it is true that the discussion did happen, and you will find a bunch of articles on this topic in the description. Yes, they did get first an answer, but the European Commission that was back then headed by a chap called Romano Prodi was very schizophrenic in its behavior, and the articles that I put down evidence to pretty clear this thing. One example is that in at the beginning of 2002, so that was after a World Trade Organization meeting, which recognized the member status of Russia within it. That's when the first discussion came up about both Russia and Ukraine joining the EU. And the answer of the Prodi administration back then, or the Prodi Commission, more like, uh, they said that there is unequivocally no chance that these countries would be joining the EU. And then suddenly, 6 months after that, when this topic came back up again, the Prodi Commission said that well, there is actually a possibility that Ukraine and Russia can join. And then the discussion died exactly there. The discussion about the EU would have been brought up many years later by the EU, by Ukraine itself, and not by Russia. Continuing on, there were also other things mentioned by Putin, which I can't exactly verify because they seemed completely pulled out of their ass. So he did not exactly go into detail, so I don't exactly know what exactly to grasp from the things that he said. He first uh, he, he first started saying that separatism in the North Caucasus was funded by the USA. But what sort of separatism is he talking about there? Who exactly, when exactly, and where exactly? If he's referring by any chance to the Chechens, while the Chechens and the terrorist acts they committed, which is why the first and the second Chechen war began. We already know, and it's not exactly quite a secret that the terrorist acts that were carried out inside Russia by the Chechen terrorists, they were FSB false flags, so the successors of KGB. Uh, then he starts moaning about CIA wanting to overthrow him and the regime. Well, I'm not exactly sure how this exactly function, considering the tight grip that he has himself upon Russia, or tight grip that he built, of course, with a network of oligarchs and other sort of thugs over time. But the CIA aren't stupid about this. They would know if by say we make here an exercise of creativity. If the CIA would ever think or and succeed in assassinating Putin, then somebody else, most likely worse than Putin, would actually end up in power. Whether it will be from his oligarch groups or someone else who would have the ideas of Putin, but actually be more would actually have a more Stalinistic edge to it, because yeah, within Russia, and especially amongst the White Russians, who are the ones that really matter for Putin and his regime, they really are nostalgic about the former days of Stalin. To take for example. somebody like Alexei Navalny would have been quite a strong contender of Putin on this topic, and people would have actually voted him because he would have been more Stalinistic in his approach than Putin would have been, and that position was and still is popular. Moving on, he says he starts lauding the military hardware of Russia, specifically the Russian hypersonic program, being the best in the world and ahead of absolutely anyone else. Here I'm just going to refer you to the article I've covered in the first podcast, meaning specifically referring to the PLA report written up by members of the Chinese military as to how they're not exactly too surprised or too amazed of the Russian Kinzhal missile. Moving on, uh, Putin keeps on mentioning this that Ukraine is a neutral state according to the Ukrainian constitution, and he perceived the Ukrainian question of joining NATO back in 2008 as being not compatible with neutrality. We're going back again to this typical KGB slash Soviet mentality of nations apparently not having the right of self-determination. Well, if the Ukrainians wanted to join NATO in 2008, that would have been their choice. And he keeps on talking about all sorts of illegitimacies that kept on happening within Ukraine, saying first that Yanukovych was actually a U.S. plant within Ukraine because a third round of elections was called up, which was something apparently unconstitutional or going against the electoral law of Ukraine back then. And then you see exactly what sort of person Putin is when he's talking, and the amount of bullshit he's spouting per minute. He then goes on to say that the reason why Russia objected to Ukraine joining the EU, so that will be the main cause of the Euromaidan protests and the revolution that happened right after that, was because through Ukraine, Russia would be flooded by EU exports because Ukraine back then was part of the CIS free trade zone. So the Russians saw themselves immediately threatened by this at an economical level. Then then he moves on to say that the going to this idea with Yanukovych being a U.S. plant. The revolution happened because armed opposition, backed by the US and the CIA, organized a coup in Kiev against Yanukovych. Again, another great example of not understanding the right of self-determination of a people. Then, to justify all the green men that suddenly appeared in Crimea in 2014, uh, Russia, does admit that Russia did take Crimea, but later on Ukraine launched the Donbass war to open the doors to NATO, which is a completely bullshit remark. Ask everybody familiar on the topic with how to join NATO, or who actually did observe especially in Eastern Europe, the processes that went on for a country in order to join NATO. Well, one of the important things and one of the critical reasons why you will not be considered into joining NATO is exactly this one. if you're going to have, or if you have by any chance any sort of territorial disputes in your country, that will not make that will not make you a NATO candidate. You'll not even be considered. And this is, for example, in the case of Romania. What happened? What happened in the late 1990s when Romania first missed the window? I think it was in 1998. And why Romania joined in 2004? Because in 1998 it was still there was still a territorial dispute between Romania and Hungary on the topic of the Szekelys in Transylvania. That one has been resolved, which is the reason why, as I said earlier, Romania did join in 2004. Plus, there were also much smaller issues, but this one was the most pressing one. So Putin making this argument that somehow Ukraine made a backdoor deal with NATO, whoever that may be within NATO, we don't know. He hasn't mentioned. He made a backdoor deal with NATO in order to in order to open the war in the Donbass, so that Ukraine would be considered into joining NATO. What? How does this make sense? Then moving on, sticking to NATO, uh, Putin also says that we never agreed for Ukraine to be part of NATO, as if Russia would have been had to be asked permission for a country which was not Russia to join NATO, even if that country is indeed bordering Russia. Well, technically, the even Poland borders Russia to some extent. Kaliningrad Oblast, which was formerly Königsberg back during the days of Prussia, is also a NATO border with Russia. But you don't. But I didn't hear I didn't hear the Russians crying too much about that back when Poland joined. I think in 1996 or 1998. Again, a direct border, and they didn't complain. It what makes this point even more egregious and even more obvious to how to just how much bullshit Volodya is spouting. Putin was at the NATO summit that was happening in Bucharest in 2008 when this discussion with Ukraine joining NATO happened. He knew and did not say anything about it. Moving on this on the topic of broken promises, he starts moaning about how the Minsk agreements were not respected by Ukraine, which is used as justification by Putin in order, for the escalation of the war that happened in February 2022. When, if we are to look, in fact, it was Russia that first broke the Minsk agreements, not the Ukrainians. And Ben, how do you think that happened? Recognizing the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And if you don't believe me, look up the Minsk agreements yourselves, and then see the section in them called "On Temporary Order of Local Self-Governance in Particular Districts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts." When Russia recognized the independence of the DPR and LPR, plus integrating them into Russia with those bogus referendums, the Russians started it themselves. Here's again an outright lie, an outright lie mixed with an exaggeration. So, and continuing this streak of lies, Putin continues to say that we wanted to reintegrate Donbass into Ukraine, but they, meaning the Ukrainians, wanted to integrate the Donbass through military means. Well, how exactly? Do you really expect us to be this fucking stupid in order to not realize that that the main supporters of the Donbas separatists were not Russians. So the Russians are the ones that behind everybody else were supporting the Donbas separatists. But at the same time, they're the ones who start moaning when the said separatists, well, you have to squash them by military means. How exactly are you meant to discuss diplomatically with them? And the Ukrainians weren't stupid. That's why they wanted reintegration through military means. It wasn't just because they were some sort of bloodthirsty barbarians. It's that they didn't have any choice. They knew very well who they were fighting against and what their strategy was. Putin keeps on going on another tirade of complete bullshit, continuing with "We did not start this war. We wanted to stop this war." And to justify everything, our aim is to remove the neo-Nazis from Ukraine. Moving to the military situation that has happened during the war. He said that we withdrew from Kiev, which is also another lie. It's not as if they were pushed back and lost the battle. There's been plenty of evidence that came up as it was happening when the war began. Do you remember the famous remark, 3 days to Kiev, and the remark that followed after, in 2 weeks, the entirety of Ukraine will fall? Well, none of it happened. Um, and both of these remarks, but particularly as the war went on, the second one with a special military operation taking only 2 weeks, remained infamous, and it remained infamous for all the right reasons, to the despair of Russian propagandists. Then moving on with other things that Putin said. For some reason, in this part of the interview, he went back to the 19th and 20th century history of Ukraine. He began saying that Ukrainian independence theorists in the 19th century wanted strong relations with Russia, which is quite a question mark. Here I'll be honest, I don't know it sufficient Ukrainian history in order to say whether this is true, whether this is partially true, or whether this is an exaggerated point or an outright lie. Also the fact that Poles wanted to suppress Ukrainians. This is another thing that he said. Well, to some extent true, but this happened only in the moment when the Ukraine in itself as a country, referring to what I said earlier in the video, the Ukrainian People's Republic, went completely apeshit and everybody started fighting each other. Uh, the Polish did actually look in the interests of the people of their Polish minority. Then he continues on talking about how Bandera and Szakiewicz collaborated with the Austrian painter himself to destroy the Poles, Jews, and the Russians. Here we also see how nicely this argument is built. It is partially true. The Poles did act repressively against Bandera and his gang in particular, the OUN, if I'm correct. But the Jews weren't exactly Bandera's concern. That was mostly the concern of the Germans, because the Germans had the biggest issue with the Jews. However, the biggest gripe of the Ukrainian neo-Nazis is that not only Ukrainian independence got squashed by Lenin in 1922, referring to what I said earlier, but there's also this funny little thing in history that happened, and that you haven't seen a mention of it. And here I'm going to also You're also going to blame Tucker Carlson for being naive and not putting this question. Well, what about the Holodomor or the Stalinist repression of Ukraine that came not just the Ukrainian people but also the Ukrainian language? Remember earlier when Putin himself said that when I went in Beregovo in the 1980s, I saw street names only in Russian and Hungarian, not in Ukrainian. Well, you can thank Stalin for that, and I'm pretty sure that he knows this, which is why he conveniently let it out. But both these things, the Holodomor and the Stalinist repression, are the main reasons why, when Nazi Germany invaded the territory of Ukraine, quite a lot of people, especially from Western Ukraine, did join to help to help Nazi Germany fight against Russia because they had all the legitimate reasons to do so. It's a it's the same reason why the Romanians jumped on the side of Nazi Germany to fight against Russia. The Romanians in 1940 didn't forget that Stalin himself not only annexed the territory of the current Chernivtsi Oblast, which was a Romanian enclave, and the territory given to Ukraine, but also the annexation of Bessarabia. And the annexation of Bessarabia in itself was the main gripe of the Romanians back then. And if you put yourself in the context, and this one's valid both when we talk about Ukraine and also Romania. If you have in the east the Russians, which have done all these things to you, and on the other side you have the Germans, uh, you're put in a situation of essentially choosing the lesser evil because you exactly don't have anything else. And to some who may think, but what about neutrality? Well, in this circumstance, neutrality would have been a very short-lived dream. It would have been a dream that would have lasted up until up until probably the first week of you declaring neutrality, when you will be definitely taken over by a disproportionately larger force. And make no mistake, not even the Romanians like to collaborate with Austrian painters, Nazi Germany, for the simple reason that thanks to the Austrian painter, through the Dictate of Vienna, about two-thirds of Transylvania were transferred to the Hungarians. Plus, also, this is a thing that sadly not a lot of history books is taught in Romania. Uh, Romania did lose the war against Germany in World War One, and the reason why the entire country somehow failed upwards is because we had damn good diplomacy, and we had damn good allies who took our case, who maintained our case against the Germans. Here I'm talking about particularly the French and the Americans, in order to gain and build the Greater Romania as it was back then. And if you are to look at what the terms of surrender were for Romania in 1917, yeah, in late 1917, when Bucharest fell, things look pretty ugly. Essentially, it would have been just what the Russians did to other countries. Um, the government would have had to be implemented by Berlin, and all the resources, especially the strategic one, would have been given as concessions slash war reparations towards Germany for 99 years, particularly oil, because oil was the main thing that got the Germans interested. More so because in the Ploiești area, so that will be Prahova County, so there'll be Prahova County. A lot of the oil refineries and the oil drills were American investments there. So they were pretty far up on on the technology ladder. Were so that the Russians did not exactly have much other access to the strategic resource back during World War One. The solution that the Kaiser came up with back in 1907 or 1908 was to build a gigantic railway line all the way to Tehran in order to bring oil. And we're talking about a period when that wasn't exactly economically feasible. We didn't exactly have seaborne oil tankers back then, nowhere to the level that existed in the post-war era. And rail cars back then were capable of carrying at most 12 tons per rail car. So you can imagine in itself what an expensive ordeal would have been, and how desperate the Germans were. So going back to this, the, when Ukrainians ended up collaborating, and especially the Ukrainian nationalists like Bandera in particular, which is why they're called neo-Nazis today, it's simply because they saw, rightfully so, the Germans as the lesser evil compared to the Russians. And can you exactly blame them when you as a country uh, get put essentially into state-sponsored starvation, just like what happened during the Holodomor? Are you not expected? Are you not expected at a level of national consciousness to have a grudge against the ones who forced it upon you? You can't because that's part of human nature. With Yes, Christianity does say that that we should forgive the ones that wronged us, but that doesn't mean that you're meant to forget them. And going back to the Christian argument, even Christianity in itself, in the Old Testament, it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Because if you don't, then you send a signal that you're ready to be exploited, essentially at the whim of your opponent. Putin continues to say that Ukrainians cannot be a separate people from Russia through Nazism, which is again completely deranged from any perspective. He for somehow for some whatever reason mentions when Zelensky was in Canada, and some Canadian MP brought Yaroslav my bad, Yaroslav Hunka, which which was indeed a Ukrainian that fought against the Soviet Union. The problem is that he served in SS Galicia, which was a special SS unit made up of the vast majority Ukrainians, specifically in order to fight against the USSR. Apparently, yes, Putin rightfully so has an issue with this. But this thing with current Ukrainians are Nazis because see, this guy and other like him have fought decades ago on the side of the Germans. It's complete lunacy. Simply put, it's complete lunacy. He then and then he continues with this lunacy, saying that the ocean painter's example lives in Ukraine, and he reiterated that this example, whoever and whatever that may be, he didn't go too much into detail. He said that they want to kill both Poles, Russians, and Jews. Yeah, well, if the let's delve into this example with how the neo-Nazi Ukrainians want to kill the Jews. How does it happen that when the war began in the very first month or so, a lot of there were a lot of Hasidic Jews that were stuck in Ukraine at the very beginning because they were I think celebrating some rabbi which was very important to their own Orthodox sect, and when I think that rabbi lived somewhere, I think in Odessa Oblast or in Zaporizhia Oblast, somewhere in that area. If what Putin says it's true, then how does it happen that all those Jews, most of them holding either Ukrainian or Russian nationality, alongside being Israeli citizens, uh, did end up not only supported to put into movement a lot of buses in order to take them to Chisinau, to Moldova, to further board planes and return to Israel. Again, if what Putin says is true, then why didn't the Ukrainians get the golden chance to organize a pogrom against them? They didn't because it's a lie. It was always a lie. Moving on with the lunacy, he moves on to say that we retreated from Kiev, but Ukrainians threw out the peace treaty at Istanbul. The retreat from Kiev being portrayed, and I will discuss this later in the video. It's being portrayed as a gesture of goodwill. It's not as if the Russians actually got pushed back and they lost the battle for Kiev back then. But here I'm going to play. I'm going to play with based on exactly what he said. If the Ukrainians did throw out the peace treaty at Istanbul, a peace treaty which also had quite a lot of lunatic demands from Russia, which meant and those demands were exactly to not only control DPR and LPR, but also for Ukrainians to retreat any claim towards Crimea, but also for Ukrainians to retreat all the way to the Dnieper line, essentially cutting them off almost completely from accessing the Black Sea. Also that providing a land bridge for the Russian forces to make contact with a separatist enclave of Transnistria, which is also known as Pridnestrovia, the separatist region east of Moldova. I call it Moldova, but it's actually the Republic of Moldova, where you have a Russian army unit stationed there, and the only reason why they remain independent is simply because that then Russian unit still exists there. If they wouldn't have existed, and if they wouldn't have waged a civil war for the so-called independence because they didn't want to they didn't want to be part of the Republic of Moldova, and they wanted to live their Soviet dream on and on, and live that Soviet dream to the extent that you can even look at their flag right now. The flag looks exactly like the flag of a former USSR country with the hammer and sickle included. So if if apparently Putin and Russia felt so betrayed, why didn't they invade Kiev again? If you said that the retreat was a gesture of goodwill, and if you felt so betrayed that the Ukrainians threw out the peace treaty from at Istanbul, then then by all means you should have restarted operations. But you didn't do so. You Putin retreated entirely from northern Ukraine. Then Tucker asked Putin what exactly did he discuss with Biden before the 22nd of February 2022, and then Putin just said that I don't remember what we talked. Here, this may be something that may develop in the future. I'm not exactly sure if Biden would like to discuss about this. I'm not exactly sure if somebody within the White House would want to open up this topic in the future. I'm not exactly sure, but for some, but Putin did insist, as Tucker insisted. What did Biden say to you? And Putin just kept on saying, well, ask him. But but he somehow derailed from the discussion with Biden, which makes it in itself suspicious, knowing Putin's background. He went on to say he went on to say things about remembering the U.S. missile defense plan that is referring to the system called Aegis Ashore, and that he again enticed Tucker Carlson to talk to U.S. member like former Secretary Gates and Condoleezza Rice. So for those people that may not know, Aegis Ashore is purely defense against strategic missiles that may appear from countries that are enemies of whether the U.S. Or NATO countries. However, Putin lies here that these can be converted into offensive platforms that can bomb Russia itself, uh, simply because since the existence of the USSR, the Russians, but particularly because since the existence of such a theoretical plan, which dates back from the days of Reagan, the Russians learned absolutely nothing after Reagan duped them in the late 1980s with the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Strategic Defense Initiative was exactly uh, much more outlandish than what Aegis Ashore is. The plan theorizes that Reagan will put high-powered lasers or space-borne counteroffensive rockets, which would intercept within singular minutes any sort of strategic missile that would ever fly out of the USSR in particular, but also China. That was not a thing that existed, and the Russians found out much later that the entire SDI program was essentially a US psyop. And apparently Putin didn't learn this lesson and still thinks, and this is the idea that he propagates, that Aegis Ashore is actually a covert way to install offensive weapons by the USA closer and closer to Russia. When even that, say that by playing here with his idea, seeing if it were true. Well, then why would the Americans install more weapons when the US already had strategic weapons deployed very close to Russia as early as 1967? And here I'm talking about all the missile silos that exist in Turkey with the US's blessing. It wouldn't have made exactly a difference to install more weapons when we talk about this, because even if you use the one single ICBM, or if you use 100 ICBMs, the mutual assured destruction principle will still apply. And the Russians were pretty close to believing that something like this would have happened in the late 1980s, when the world, because of their stupidity, was very close to starting a nuclear war. Um, Tucker continues to ask Putin whether he would invade Poland, and Putin said that we would invade Poland, or only if Poland invades Ukraine, we will invade them. We have no interest in Poland right here. But then, if the Poles want to invade Ukraine, then what exactly is your deal with all of this? but here it's something that's much deeper, and it ties to the history lesson, the 25-minute history lesson that Putin carried in the start of the interview. The Russians are apparently still salty that they lost the conflict against Pilsudski in the 1920. There's no other reason why he would say this, and another reason why Putin would say this, which is also what I think that Tucker was a pretty naive person to put this question. Because Tucker should have known that this question is stupid, simply because he should have known that if the Russia would have invaded at any point Poland for whatever reason or no reason, that means a breach of NATO Article 5. Well, not exactly a breach of Article 5, but Article 5 of the NATO treaty would get triggered, meaning that the entirety of NATO militaries would start at a moment's notice to invade the aggressor, in that case being Russia. And the Russians know this very well, and the Russians are afraid of this because probably because leaving aside the people with Stalinist nostalgia, particularly amongst the Russians that left the country due to fear that they will be mobilized into that clown show that is the VKS. There has been a constantly growing sentiment between them, but also between Russian nationals that live further east, especially in the Siberia region. They started thinking that probably it's a better idea that NATO invades us because we're sick of this entire situation. We are sick of being perceived on the planet uh, as the violent clowns. And I'm pretty sure Putin is aware of this, and he would not want at all to give anybody more of a reason to even look at him more suspiciously, let alone to give them a legitimate reason to get there. Because yeah, if NATO were to get there, then it would have been just a matter of time until Russia would have gotten broken up into tens of other small countries, countries which ironically would have under that new status quo much more independence and much more of a right to self-determination when it comes to the way they rule themselves, much more than what they have right now under Putin's regime. And that's why things like uh, the scares that Putin had, especially with the Jews from Buryatia when that airport has been taken over, or I'm not sure if it was Buryatia or Bashkortostan. It was one of those Muslim majority oblasts within Russia, and he got so panicked that something may happen there. He dispatched his own Praetorian Guard uh, to calm the people there, and that Praetorian Guard of his being called the Rosgvardia. Uh, Moving on, Tucker asks who blew up Nord Stream. Putin then answered Tucker with saying that it was you. By that meaning Tucker. It's as if Tucker did it. Sure, it was a joke in itself, but to anybody that knows about how intelligence agents function, that was exactly a trick of Putin to look into the micro expressions of a person. And he played on this aspect that yes, it's not exactly it's not like a secret that that Tucker Carlson did try to join the CIA, and Putin did humiliate him when saying that if the Tucker would have joined the CIA, that would have been a big mistake. He then moved on to say that actually the CIA did it. Um So Tucker did put a legitimate question. Well, what evidence do you have that the CIA did it? Uh, and Putin continued to say that not everyone has the tools to dive into the Baltic and blow up a gas pipeline. Well, to some extent, he is right, but he isn't. The investigation, as it stands in February 2024, is still ongoing. No clear culprit has been found yet. Uh, there has been apparently a yacht seized by Germany, but everything that's about this mini debacle with what happened to the Nord Stream, it's still there are just rumors. There have been no conclusive results from that investigation as of right now. But Putin still continues to think that the Germans apparently may know, but they're for some reason sandbagging the investigation. It's not as if the Germans wouldn't have had anything to say about this, since they're the ones that lost the most out of those gas pipelines going inoperative, simply because eh, if you are to remember, after the war began, and especially after those gas pipelines were sabotaged, the price of natural gas in the entirety of the EU jumped to some absurd heights. And out of all the countries, the one that was hurt the most was Germany, especially German industry, because German industry was built over the decades on the premise that we will get cheap hydrocarbons uh, from Russia. And when those cheap hydrocarbons suddenly disappear, that obviously caused a shock within the larger economy. And then and then he poses this question that why wouldn't Germany say anything about the Nord Stream? And he continues on to say because the Germans serve the collective West and not their national interest. And then we want to turn them on, but Germans keep the pipeline closed. That is also another lie. The Russian terminal at Viborg, which is I think this one that is still on the Nord Stream. I'm not sure if it was. I think it was Nord Stream 2, the one that is still damaged but still repairable. Or I'm not sure if it has been repaired. Uh, that terminal is missing some critical components. Here I'm referring to some special Siemens pressurization turbines that have been stuck in Canada as they were sent on maintenance before the war began, and due to sanctions, yes, they've been repaired by Siemens, but they haven't been sent back to Russia for obvious reasons. That will go against the sanctions. Moving on, and in order to at least keep this video slightly shorter and much easier to listen, uh, this interview keeps on discussing uh, about multipolarity. Putin started going on a tirade about the hemispheres of a brain. I don't didn't exactly understand what was the point of that. He then he began talking about the US dollar and de-dollarization. He tried to make a point about how Chinese foreign policy is more open to compromise than the US and the West will ever be, which is bullshit. We can all see how much Russia is buying outright in Siberia as a payment for all the shoddy assistance Russia is getting to this war. And he keeps on saying that he went on the topic that the BRICS countries are developing very rapidly, and the BRICS countries have a bigger share than the G7 countries these days. Things which are irrelevant. And then in order to demoralize the people who do not know how sanctions work and why do they exist. He went on saying that we were sanctioned on almost everything, but we are still the number one economy in Europe in 2022 and 2023. Yeah, to some extent, but that's not exactly how sanctions work. Sanctions work over the course of a few years. It's essentially the strategy of starving your enemy from any sort of outside help and assistance. And make no mistake, when it comes to Russian industry, it was heavily dependent on Western imports, especially Western imports of technology. I'll give you one clear example. In the Russian petrochemical industry, in these days, you cannot make the gasoline required to run a car without using certain components that are made only in the West. And here we'll also touch a bit on this fact that yes, even though the USSR is dead, the Russian Federation still lies in their statistics. And if by any chance you know Russian, there are always tidbits of evidence that appear in the Russian press, um, shining, yes, a small torchlight, but a light nonetheless on how bad the situation actually is within Russia. But I'll give you an example, which is much more accessible: the exchange rate in itself. Yeah, you may go on Google right now and look and see that the exchange rate between the US and the ruble and the Russian ruble would be something like 100 and something rubles per dollar. Yeah, that is the official exchange rate, so that will be the exchange rate from the Russian National Bank. In reality, the black market exchange rate, the one that's much closer to reality, is is twice or even three times higher than the official exchange rate. And every Russian that holds dollars knows this. Every Russian is aware of this. That no Russian would be this stupid to go through official channels to exchange their US dollars. That's also the reason why at the beginning, in the very first year of the war, Russia imposed really serious capital controls on bank accounts, especially bank accounts in foreign currency, especially US dollars. Is because they knew that this was going to happen. And there's also another piece of evidence why holding cash is always a good idea. If the Because you don't think that you're going to go to a black market guy that exchanges US dollars. You're going to go and do a bank transfer to him. Fuck no, you're going to give him the dollar bill, and you will get and you'll get whatever rate it is at that moment, or you are capable to negotiate at that moment. Continuing on, more moaning about NATO expansion and repeating the thing with Caucasus terrorists and missile defense and the missile defense program, mentioning how these are instruments of pressure that the US has imposed against Russia since the fall of the USSR. Then how apparently the USA and NATO aim to break up Russia in order to prop them up against the conflict with China, which is not exactly something that people think. Yeah, it will be interesting to at least explore this part, but a lot of people know that in the West you don't have even the starting block of something like this. You don't have the vision necessary to do such a thing, let alone, and we see this every day. The, the West, even though it's been against the conflict for so long, against Russia, no matter in which way it existed, whether we're talking here about how the British Empire was a direct competitor uh, against Russia, or later on, later on for a short period of time, Germany being in direct conflict against Russia. And once Germany disappeared, the US became a direct competitor against Russia. Even after the Cold War, the West is still really, really naive about what Russia is and how Russia functions and how the Russian people function, and particularly how their propaganda functions, which is why you look at the way things are right now, and the people still haven't woken up to the fact that that a lot of the social issues faced right now by Western societies do stem from the propaganda that was funded and disseminated by the KGB decades ago. If you don't believe me, go and check Yuri Bezmenov and Active Measures. He then made an example about Indonesia, saying apparently how the world is changing, but in itself, bringing up the example of Indonesia, I don't exactly see the how does it relate to the discussion at hand. He then moved on to attack Zelensky directly. This is something that I cannot exactly verify. He brought up this aspect that Zelensky promised during his election back in 2019, I think, that he will end the war in Ukraine. I'm not exactly sure this has actually happened, even though right now I cannot verify this because, well, I don't exactly speak Ukrainian, I can't read Ukrainian, not yet at least, and I don't have access to a person that I can ask. But on this topic with ending the war in Ukraine, that is something that not even the Ukrainian population wanted when the annexation of Crimea happened in 2014. The Ukrainian people were very mad about that. The Ukrainian people, some a smart person said at that point that for this transgression the Ukrainians will never forget the Russian people, not the Russian state, the Russian people. They'll never forget what they did for the next 200 years. Saying that Zelensky ran on this platform and won on this platform that he will end the war in Ukraine, and apparently he didn't end it, but actually escalated it. Uh, it is as far as it is currently a bullshit statement. Then he keeps on going towards the diplomatic aspect. We have never refused negotiations, relating again to the peace treaty from Istanbul, and making a reminder again of what absurd demands Russia had exactly from Ukraine. You can't exactly blame the Ukrainians for not taking you seriously and throwing your peace treaty out. And then in order to reinforce this point about the friendship or the brotherhood between the Russian and Ukrainian people, he says that all peoples of Russia consider themselves part of the motherland, somehow making this illusion that within Russia people are united, but those who are against Russia but used to be brothers are not, and there's some sort of crazy radicals which need to be reintegrated. Not only there are stark differences in perception within Russia itself. And I'll give you a clear example. Uh, Within Russia, up until the war began, there used to be quite a lot of immigrants that would come to work inside Russia from the Central Asian countries. So I'm talking here about people from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and to a lesser extent to Kyrgyzstan. And those sort of people, they will be the ones moving into apartments and living 4 to 8 people in the same room in order to save the money and to save the money and send that money further to their families in the countries they came from. If you are to look right now on Russian websites for renting properties, you'll definitely see, especially Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also in other cities within Russia, especially those cities which are close to the Central Asian countries. You'll definitely see this the remark of no Asians allowed or white Russians only. So it's also the perception of the same white Russians against other people at the level of societal perception. Take for example the Tajiks and the name and the name of the country where they come from, of Tajikistan. But the Tajiks themselves essentially translate slightly more colloquially into black asses. Now, what country has considered another country which they get immigrants from as black asses in the next century? I don't exactly know, but I don't think even not even the British Empire 200 years ago had such open perceptions to this level. Then then Tucker went on another tangent, talking about the imprisonment of Evan Gershkovich. Here, I'm not going to talk about it because it's simply something that only Americans care about, and I honestly don't know much about it because it apparently, as far as I know, it happened in 2023, so barely a year ago, and God knows exactly what's happening there with this guy. Most likely, it's a high possibility that what the Russians are doing is it's essentially what the North Koreans used to do and are still doing, which is when things on the diplomatic front don't go your way, you take hostages. You take essentially as hostages people from certain countries which you want to pull something out of. And that's the thing that Putin made really clear when he's talking about we had many gestures of goodwill and we kind of ran out of them, and we may still do consider releasing Gershkovich only if they are reciprocated. Yeah, right. Just as if just as what happened with that guy from that was imprisoned in North Korea because he took a propaganda poster from the wall and they discovered it in his backpack. I think his name was Otto Warmbier. Well, not only got imprisoned and tortured there, but when finally the U.S. diplomatic efforts took him out of North Korea, he didn't have he was so beaten up and so drugged up that he wouldn't have survived for too long. I think he survived for 6 more weeks when he reached the US, and that was it. So the strategy is not unknown to those who are aware of it, and it's definitely not something unknown to the US, both related to the state apparatus, but also the intelligence apparatus. They know that Gershkovich it will be used if it hasn't been used already as a bargaining chip in one way or another by Putin and Russia. So, key takeaways to conclude this report, because it's been almost 2 hours since I've been recording this constantly. Well, it is always best for a conflict such as this one to present both sides, and that's exactly what Tucker did. This interview is targeted by Putin and by the Russian state, which are still masters of propaganda, as we've discussed, to the naive Americans, especially the dissident right, and Tucker will gain positive traction. after this interview, not because he may be a Russophile or he may be an FSB plant, but because the American mainstream media failed time and time again in their profession to not be hysterical. It was something really simple. Do not be hysterical about things. They were already poisoning the population before the pandemic with their hysteria. During the pandemic, the mainstream media was openly hostile to the population and getting a lot of money from governments and other dubious interest groups to keep the pandemic panic up, leading to the current mistrust about reports on the Russia-Ukraine war. Add on top of that the hysterical reporting of Trump during his campaign in 2016. That is also the fault of the journalists. Alongside the Trump Russia probe, where they portrayed then President Trump as a Russian plant himself. Now, as of 9th of February 2024, they demonized Tucker for doing the interview. They were also hysterical before the interview got published when Tucker already announced that he will do the interview with Putin at some point. It's a sign, as mentioned earlier, that no one learned anything, and the media will be at some point swept out by the population, because no honest conversations could have been carried out for at least a decade uh, within those groups, and the media is polarizing to hell with no chance whatsoever to recover. As both sides of the political spectrum are also polarized, the population is also polarized. Essentially, it's a recipe for a potential disaster. And this ties to what I said in the second episode of the Victor News Network about how difficult the 2024 presidential campaign will be for both sides. Because tensions at the level of the populace are running really high, and the media is fueling both sides from their own way, whether willingly or by stupidity. On another side, this interview shows how Russia operates in propaganda. Get some mostly truthful things, sneak in a few exaggerations, and then you add the ones outright bullshit while completely ignoring things that will seriously put you in a negative light. Examples are plenty in this video, covered by me, but to talk about the military operations, the so-called gestures of goodwill that Putin mentioned, like the retreat from Kiev that never happened. He hasn't fought back against that area either. But the syntagm is meant to portray the Russians as some noble liberators waging a chivalrous war against the Ukrainian neo-Nazism. The Ukrainian Kharkiv counteroffensive has also been portrayed as a gesture of goodwill. Barely anyone outside of the military artists or ex-military talked about the failure of Russian logistics in supporting the assault with fuel, food, and other supplies. Izium, what used to be a major VKS hub and staging area, when the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive, the Russians also portrayed that as a gesture of goodwill. Strictly on the war, Putin remains a master strategist. As a personal prediction, as how will this be perceived? The dissident right, which includes radical Zoomers, the boomers with too much free time, alongside the naive and disenfranchised, will swallow this interview whole, and they will not do any sort of verification on the information portrayed. And ironically, this will advantage Donald Trump himself. Donald Trump, who has been very vocal against the Ukraine assistance packages, as the population hasn't been given the whole story and will continue to blindly play into the mainstream media-fueled hysteria. This is all that I can say about this. This video is almost just as long as the interview. If you want to listen to the interview itself, you're welcome to do so. As I told you, I couldn't have covered absolutely anything, but at least I hope that with some explanations and some additions to the things they said have been at the very least interesting to you. I reiterate that I don't claim to possess all the truth. Uh, on the topic of the interview, I did receive information from somebody that knows Russian and has seen the interview that apparently the English translation, the English voiceover is way too simplistic compared to what Putin actually said. So that's also another nebulous cloud that's been thrown into this. But as I don't have access to the original audio, nor that I know Russian, nor I don't have a Russian translator which would have enough time and money to start writing a transcript of everything that Putin has said and then translate it later on or explained much better. It is what it is. Well, I hope you enjoyed this and see you next time. Cheers.